Thanks very much for your time, Kev. And first up, just want to say a big congratulations for the progress you've been making. I'm curious as to how it feels from your perspective with regards to what have we got? Two popes, one queen, one prime minister so far.
Well, it feels good for, because it's very personal for me. It's been 25 years. I've had friends die, my family break up. I've seen the effect of these crimes on the ground with people, as I did for many years as a clergyman. But just as a human being, you've got to be happy that these crimes by the powerful are being exposed, and we're having an effect way beyond our numbers. So, I often say to people, I can die happy because, I've just stood by what I know is right, and what else can you do, right?
Yeah, I was having a look at your book Unrelenting, and a couple of names spring to mind, and you wonder, back from the early days, how these guys are. I appreciate there's been a couple of people that didn't make it, fallen comrades, you might say, such as Harriet was an interesting character, but also Don Epperson. I guess he was pretty old, right?
Oh, I knew him in my 20s. We're talking like 40 years ago. He was just, it's funny how people have that impact. You don't realize at the time the impact one person can have on your life, right? Kind of like plants a seed. But he used to do these one-man pickets outside City Hall in Hamilton, which is a big steel town. It's where I worked there in my 20s, steel industry. And Don used to just not worry about how he looked or the effect it'd have. He just was there. And he'd been fighting that way his whole life. He was just a fighter. And he had amazing stories, right, of what it was like in the Depression, how brutal it was, people being killed left and right by the police all the time, by the army. It's that way all over the world. And so he just inspired me that he, in his 70s, he was almost 80. He was still going strong, right, because he knew what was right,
And he gave you a bit of a hard time back then for joining the church, for becoming a clergyman.
Well, for going to university, I left Hamilton to go to Vancouver to go to school. And he didn't like that. He thought I should stay there and do what needed to be done. And I think later when I didn't become a minister for like 10 years after that, after I started university. But I think if he had known, yeah, he would have had a problem with that for sure.
And another name that I couldn't see, how it unfolded was Katie at the churches. She was.
Oh,
yeah. How's she? Is she still with us?
As far as I know, I haven't been in touch with her for quite a while. She's, well, since last year sometime. She's native. She's Huron from Eastern Canada. And, when people find out their native ancestry, it does a funny thing. In Canada, it's so suppressed. Like I had a great grandmother who was Cree, Ojibwe Cree in Winnipeg, and nobody in the family talked about it. They said, no, we're pure Scottish, Scots-Irish, But I said, well, in Canada, anywhere in North America, it's unlikely that anybody, or anywhere in the world for that matter, that anyone's pure anything, right? So she's had her own struggle trying to find out who she is and why there's such an enormous guilt and denial about Indigenous people, probably no doubt because people know after our work especially what we did to so many of them and their children, right?
Right. And so you talk about that sort of family secret of the Indigenous aspect, and then you can get straight into the sort of eugenics and the stock aspect. And reading your book about the horrors with Shaw, the little girl who was kicked down the stairs.
Maisie Shaw, yeah.
Maisie Shaw. And so you wonder how the lack of empathy, we're talking psychopathy here, a guy kicks a little girl down a flight of concrete steps and she dies at the bottom in front of her friends. Is that pretty much how it is?
Well, Harriet Nahani was hiding under the stairs. It was on Christmas Eve, 1946. And you see, Harriet was a traditionalist. Her dad was a traditional CM or elder. And they targeted the children of that because they had authority. I remember Harriet said, whenever they were given an order in the school, the kids would look to her to see if they should, you know, go along with it, because they traditionally look to the elders in their families. But Harriet,
and she was a chief's daughter.
yeah,
Yeah.
but because of that, this Alfred Caldwell, the principal, would target her. She said they took me into his office every night and raped her year after year, just constant. So that night, Christmas Eve, Harriet was hiding from Caldwell under the stairs. She heard his familiar voice arguing with a matron about Maisie, who was crying for her mother. And she was looking up, and she saw Caldwell kick her in the stomach, went flying down the stairs. And then Harriet, we've got that interview of her describing her eyes weren't moving, she wasn't breathing, she was just lying there. And they just ignored her. They kept arguing at the top of the stairs. So it shows you like the inhumanity, right, going on all over. That's one story of many.
And you print a list of the crimes in Unrelenting regarding all these methods of torture and brutality that just are so congruent with what we know about the Nazis. I visited Auschwitz, and the one you mentioned in the list of crimes, official crimes, about standing in the freezing cold with the ice. That really took me straight back to a time I visited in Auschwitz, and that's what the Nazis were doing to concentration camp visitors there. So we have these kind of connotations and clear links with the concentration camps, and then you look at the transference of European Nazism over the Atlantic, with these rat lines of the Catholic Church and with the Operation Paperclip. And we come to some serious characters who spanned the Atlantic. And we're talking Joseph Mengele style brutality on these Indigenous kids in Canada, right?
Yeah, actually more Nazis were brought to Canada after World War II than any country in the world. Thousands were brought in, often to get fake IDs and then brought down to the US, kind of in the back door, to work on the space program, all the MK Ultra mind control research pioneered by the Nazis. These guys were the infamous example of Reinhard Gehlen, who was Hitler's chief of counterintelligence on the Eastern Front, recruited by the CIA, helped formulate State Department Cold War policies, helped set up the CIA, because of his extensive intel network in Eastern Europe, right? But part of that was these medical doctors. A lot of them stayed in Canada and worked at places like the Allen Institute in Montreal, where this Dr. Ewan Cameron was pioneer in reshaping memory and personality. Used a lot of kids. We've had eyewitnesses describe Native children literally being brought in cages and then experimented to death. You know, right up to the 1980s, you know, this stuff going on and still going on, just more hidden. And so, yeah, there was a direct Nazi link, but don't forget the whole eugenics movement actually began in America and was picked up by the Nazis, like the first sterilization laws against Aboriginal people, against the so-called mentally defective, brought in America in the 1880s and 90s, right into the early 20th century. So it's kind of like there's cross-Atlantic, you know, sharing of all these genocidal crimes going on, right?
Well, you can go even more global, can't you? With you know, you look at the stolen generation of Australia and this sort of thing, and we're dealing with a present day global network that still functions intrinsically with this sort of thing in the shadows, right?
We find that especially the more research we did on the Vatican connection, and how at the center of all of the stuff the Vatican's been for many centuries. You know, they just keep cropping up like a dirty sock all the time wherever you look. And also, not only because they have so much money and state support, but it's writing their history. You know, all the first laws authorizing the conquest, you know, the Inter Caetera bulls of the 15th century, all came out of Rome. It all justified genocide, right?
And you get members of the public today, and they like to box it and contain it and put it aside as something bad that happened historically. But we're talking centuries, if not more, with regards to a very similar thread of oppression, enslavement, invasion, murder, right? That the Catholic Church won't be able to palm off as a couple of individuals gone bad.
No, and the simplest proof of that is if you go to our website, murderbydecree.com, and you go into Appendix 4, we've reprinted this document that was leaked from a Vatican library insider to the London Observer in 2004. It's called Crimen Solicitanus, which in Latin means the crime of solicitation. And it refers to the standing Catholic Church policy when children are raped. And it says, first of all, it's a pontifical secret, which means it's coming from the Pope and no one's to talk about it. If you talk about it, and if you tell a policeman that this child's been raped by a priest, you're excommunicated, right? So it's a green light to every child rapist to say you can come into the Catholic Church, you'll be protected, and anyone who snitches is thrown into hell, which is what a Catholic thinks of excommunication, right?
And then you come to this the cover-up Truth and Reconciliation Committee in Canada, and you mentioned in the book about how the church seemed to palm off the culpability, the guilt, towards the state, i.e., the governmental forces. That was quite interesting to me. That suggests the hierarchy. It has the church very much above the government, and the government can be the scapegoat of the church.
Right. They've had that tag team relationship from the very beginning. They both set up these death camps they call residential schools, where over half the kids never came back, and that death rate spanned decades. It wasn't just one occurrence. It was a constant feature of a death rate 2 to 3 times that you'd find in the African slave trade, the Black Death in Europe. Even the death rate in Auschwitz and Treblinka was about half of what it was in your average Indian residential school. And yet this is not called genocide. So the churches and government did it all along. They set up their own inquiry. They control the process. They appoint the commissioners. They're not allowed to take any evidence which names a crime or a perpetrator. They go through the statements of Native survivors to edit out anything they don't like. And no charges are ever laid. And the whole thing is eventually put under secret reps. And the Canadian Ontario Court of Appeal recently ruled that they can destroy all the evidence if they want from a crime scene. Courts in Canada allow that, right?
So we got the church, which is a transnational criminal organization. We got the government, which is scapegoated by the church and taking the heat for these concentration camps for children. We got the legal system, which is a complete joke and totally corrupt. And then plus there's aspects of the corporate side where they're clearing large parts of Canada in order to gain access to the land, because if the people are gone, then it's fair game for the companies to make profit from. And so basically, are we looking at Native Canadian children, not necessarily not necessarily children, but also perhaps adults as well? They're almost residual collateral from the clearing of the profitable land in Canada. Is that fair enough summary?
Yeah, very much. As a matter of fact, it's one of the ways it still goes on. One of the things we document now, there's 2 clusters in Canada on the West Coast and in northern Saskatchewan, where on the prairies, where these massive disappearances of not just Native women, but whole families are going on. And it's because there's valuable resources there. Uranium in northern Saskatchewan, that's where the US military get most of their depleted uranium from Canada. And on the West Coast, because of all the resources there, which are largely owned by Chinese corporations. And our sources tell us all the time that these Native families are being terrorized off their land with the help of the government chiefs, disappeared entirely, killed off or scared off, just to get those lands and resources, like the British used to do, and now then the Americans, now the Chinese are doing it. I mean, it's the same old game.
Yeah, you hear identical stories from the Amazon, South America.
Exactly. Yeah.
Kev, can I ask a little more of a broad question regarding Christianity as a whole? I'm trying to join the dots between the horrific child abuse, horrors, murders, ritual sacrificial stuff, and the more lower down everyday situation with regards to people who have Christianity at the core of their essence and their faith. The logo of Christianity is of an indigenous son being sacrificed in the most torturous manner imaginable. In light of recent common law revelations of evidence regarding the mandatory participation of all popes in ninth circle cult child-killing ceremonies involving drinking the blood and eating the flesh, what basis can the Christian faith continue as a reputable foundation for public spirituality?
Well, I don't think it can. As a matter of fact, for people to even donate money to the Catholic or the Anglican Church, or in Canada, the United Church, means under international law, they're committing a felony. They're funding what's called transnational criminal organizations that harm people, traffic children, launder money for organized crime.
So can we condense that in and say that anybody who is participating in Christianity, particularly if they're funding Christianity, regardless of denomination, is complicit in a transnational criminal organization?
Well, de facto, yes. One example of that is the Pope recently spoke to the World Council of Churches, which is an umbrella group for all the Protestant churches, most of them in the world, except the more fundamentalist ones. And they are all in agreement with his plan to have one world church affiliated through the Church of Rome, which means the Vatican Bank. And so, yes, they're all directly complicit. And it's kind of like saying, you can be, let's say you're an anti-Semite and you're convinced Jews are running the world. You may not be a member of the Nazi party of their particular church, but your ideology is contributing to that crime. And that was described in Nuremberg, and so being all the basis of international human rights conventions ever since, that you're complicit if you're paying those taxes, if you're putting money in the church or attending it. So the very image of Jesus dying on a cross, don't forget the cross didn't appear till about the 3rd century, when the Catholic Church was being incorporated as the first corporation really in Rome. And it became the Roman state. I mean, the Roman state transmorphed into the Catholic Church. So even the term Pontifex Maximus, the Great Bridge that the Roman Emperor used, that's the Pope's official title, right? Vicari Christi, the replacement of Christ. I mean, it's all there for people to see, right? If you go beneath the surface and see that it is a criminal syndicate.
And with the crucifix, it's almost as though it's a sort of a voodoo warning, perhaps, that if the Pontifex is deified, is the God here on earth, and then the indigenous son is slaughtered on a cross. Watch out, everybody! Buckle under, otherwise this could happen to you. This is the subcontext, right?
Very much, and that in fact is how any elite historically has ever ruled. You keep the majority of people traumatized and in fear, and incapable of accessing their indigenous power. Like when Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." He didn't say it was externally. He didn't say it was in a church or a pope or a communion wafer. He said it's here. We're self-governing. That's what the Founding Fathers of America said. Sovereignty rests here, begins and ends here in each one of us. It's not given to you. You're born with it. You just have to exercise it. That's natural law, common law. And so that is greater than any legal system or political system on the planet. And rulers don't want us to access that knowledge and practice it. And we saw just a few of us doing this work. Look at the effect it had because they're afraid, and they hide behind, like in the Wizard of Oz, a little man behind the big mask. That's exactly who they are. So we just have to pull the mask back.
And you've done so with Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, and also with Bergoglio, Pope Francis. So that's two tips of the pyramid that are officially criminals, have been found guilty by common law courts, which span the international borders and are, so people are now at liberty to put a posse together and haul in either Pope and incarcerate him, right?
They have an obligation under international law, if you know a crime is going on, and the citizen arrest laws in many nations as well compel people. It's not just feel like doing it if you want. You're compelled to stop any harm that may happen, especially to children in your community. In American courts, it's called a necessity defense. When the protesters would go into missile silos and wreck the missiles, which some of the groups did in the 70s and 80s. They won in court sometimes by saying the threat of nuclear war necessitated us breaking the law, just like you have the right to break a window to go save a child. Same thing here. The Catholic Church, especially by operating, is putting whole populations of children in danger. And so we have an obligation to stop that, right? And that's not terrorism or vigilantism, that's the law, right?
And can you clear up specifically what Bergoglio, Pope Francis, is guilty of? It's child trafficking in Argentina?
It's a number of things. It's by his, first of all, what they call in the law command responsibility. He's the head of the corporation that's doing these crimes. So he's guilty that way. The same way Elizabeth Windsor in England is. But as with Elizabeth Windsor, he was also personally implicated in the disappearance of children from these facilities. So also he's been seen at Ninth Circle events. And when he was an archbishop in Argentina, he was an actively complicit member of the military junta. He was helping traffic the children of political prisoners. He was turning a blind eye when he knew people were being tortured and thrown out of helicopters into the ocean. He was acting like the PR man, front man for the military junta. That's why in 3 years, he went from being a lowly priest to the head of the whole Jesuit order in Argentina.
Because he was profiled as a bad guy. Perfect. Come up the top.
He was directly complicit, and he's also complicit with the present Queen of the Netherlands, Maxima Zoriega, who's Argentine, whose father was in the junta. And according to a Dutch journalist who works with their network, she just published this stuff. Her name's Ella Stur. She found that Queen Maxima had actually been paying Jorge Bergoglio 12,000 euros a month for 9 years. And we don't know why that bribe, whatever it was going on, and the Dutch royal family had been named by eyewitnesses as being directly involved in these Ninth Circle rituals and the human hunting parties and all of these things that have been described, right? So.
And a name that crops up around the Netherlands, Belgium is Beatrice. These connected. Can you explain about the human hunting parties? Again, a lot of people have difficulty believing that anything quite so horrific could occur.
Well, that's Queen Beatrix. She's the Queen Mother. She stepped down so that her son Willem Alexander, who's the present king, and Maxima Zoriega could take over. Interestingly, she stepped down the same month that Ratzinger did, in February 2013. Because
was she on your Dirty 30 list? The 30.
She wasn't, but she had been named by two of our eyewitnesses, Toos Nienhuis and Anne-Marie van Blienberg. Both of them, Toos was born into the Ninth Circle satanic cult. Anne-Marie was recruited into it, kind of blackmailed into it. But they both saw Ratzinger and other top cardinals at these sacrificial rituals. The human hunting parties involved adolescents taken out of youth detention centers in Amsterdam with the order of Queen Beatrix, delivered to a site just outside Brussels in the forest, and then hunted. The soldiers had the area cordoned off, and they were stripped naked and hunted by a group of very elite politicians. And she lists all of them, generals, Mark Rutte, the Premier of Holland, just all of these guys. And Catholic Archbishop Alfrink from Utrecht. I mean, all of these guys are named and seen. They hunted these kids, they killed them, and then they cut off the penises of the males and put them up on plaques in this chateau where they all went after. And it's kind of like when you have that kind of absolute power and money, unlimited money. Unfortunately, people are then tempted to think they are God and they can do anything they want. And unfortunately, the system allows them to get away with these crimes and even encourages them.
So going forward, we're talking about, in an arch, you have a keystone. These are keystone individuals with regards to the pinnacle of societies, whether it's kings or queens or popes or presidents. All there seems to be this network club that is manipulating each other through the severity of the crimes. You got to keep it secret, otherwise, you're going to get hauled in a prison, and anybody who's doing anything so horrific is not going to last 2 minutes. So this kind of club of secrecy seems very, very secure with that respect. But you've got these guilty verdicts of so many of these top VIPs. And so how do you envisage it moving forwards with regards to justice? Obviously, it's a numbers game with regards to a critical mass of public clamoring for this kind of justice to be enforced, right?
Well, we found one thing that happens, which is encouraging, is that other courts can issue warrants based on a common law verdict. So yeah, we don't have the means to go out and arrest Bergoglio at the moment, although attempts were made twice, including in Geneva last summer at the World Council of Churches meeting. We don't have that power right now, but other courts do. They can issue arrest warrants. And that's in fact what the Spanish government threatened to do to Ratzinger 6 days before he resigned. That's why he stepped down.
So the official Spanish government have proclaimed, have stated that Ratzinger for them is an international criminal. He comes near Spain, he gets nicked.
They didn't go that far, but what they said in a diplomatic note so Ratzinger resigned on February 11th. They came in on February 6th, so 5 days before he resigned. And it was addressed to the Secretary of State, Tarcisio Bertoni, who then stepped down himself, as well as Ratzinger. It said that based on the information that's seen in our docket, linking Ratzinger personally with the cover-up of not just the rape of children, but the trafficking and killing of them, based on that, he might face arrest if he came to Spain. And then he resigns. So that's telling you a lot right there, right?
And the relationship between civil law courts and common law, is that quite an encouraging bridge between the two camps?
Well, what you call civil law is really much kind of a de facto administrative law, which means it's not operating according to the rules of law or evidence or anything. They're private, like military courts. Sometimes they're called admiralty courts, where the judge has absolute power. You know, they can change the record, whatever. In a common law court, the jury has the power. The judges are just advisors to the jury. And America, I think, is the only country in the world where you're given the constitutional right to a common law jury trial. I don't know where anywhere else it does it, but it doesn't mean people can't do it. They have, like I say, the inborn right to convene these things, especially when their own courts are implicated in these crimes.
And is the prevalence, from your perspective as field secretary, are you seeing the prevalence of common law courts and people understanding their rights with regards to sovereignty and autonomy to perform the law as they see it with the jury system? Are the numbers increasing?
I would say yes, but it goes up and down all the time because anyone who tries this is immediately under the gun. We've even had incidents in America where, like, the sheriffs are elected locally in America. It's like the old English tradition where in every shire they had, well, that's what sheriff means. It means shire reeve. The reeve from the local shire had the right to form a jury, gather all the men to pursue criminals. There was that grassroots law going on, right? And so sheriffs in America are elected by the local people. They're not answerable to the government. And we brought sheriffs into our common law training workshops. But they all say the same thing. If we go up against these people politically, we're dead, because the attorney general, the governor, they're all working with these criminals often, right? And so they don't know what to do because they're coming up politically against the whole system. And you reach a certain mass and then you're hitting that, right? That political reality of the system.
From the USA perspective, the federal shell over the whole of the states, as opposed to the local sheriff's jurisdiction.
Well, and the state governments as well. A perfect example of recently when we began to discover in the Mormon Church the same crimes going on. In Utah, the governor, the attorney general, they're all Mormons. It's like a theocratic state where everyone is all in the same church. It's impossible for people. It's like trying to integrate the church or society in Mississippi in the 60s. You know, you had to get support from the outside because the regime was just so violent and controlled that local people were stymied. And that's why the importance of these kind of interviews and getting this word out, because it brings help to the people trying to do that, right, in the local areas.
All right. Kev, you wrote in Unrelenting about Legion, and the importance of calling out the name of the forces against you, moving away from the law and the practicalities. How harrowing was it when you first realized that you were isolated and there were esoteric other dimensional powers in metaphysical realms pitted against you, while just a lone individual standing up against this network power grid that we mentioned?
Well, you know, one of my ancestors was a guy in England called Peter Annett, and he was a free-thinking, like a deist. He was a free thinker, and he got thrown in Bridewell Prison in London because he challenged the literacy of the literal truthfulness of the Bible. And he said we should employ reason to ask ourselves, well, could Jesus really have changed water into wine and walk on the water, etc.? They threw him in the prison for blasphemous libel. And it's kind of funny because I've always come out of that free thinking tradition myself. Say, even as a clergyman, I said, okay, well, we're given reason to figure these things out, right? And I don't have any direct proof of these forces that you describe. I've seen the impact. I don't know what they are. They're violent and murderous, and they seem to feed off human indignity and suffering and death. But the problem with trying to put too specific a label on that is that then people are divided in their interpretations, right? It's like religion. It does that. It tends to divide people rather than finding our common ground. So I don't want to give a specific answer in that I have knowledge of exactly what's going on, because I don't. But I do know on the ground the effect this is having, and it does seem to have a control over a lot of people's thinking. People are, so many times people have dropped away without reason, without just like that, in fear and panic. And it can't just be that they're all being threatened. That doesn't make any sense. It's that there's something else at work on them. And it could be the fact that, you know, all of us at a young age are traumatized in one way or the other, just growing up in this society. But also, you know, as a kid, you're always taught, well, don't think that, think this, don't do that, do this. Other people know better than you. Like, you know, we're harmed at a young age, just our natural innocence and smarts, right? And nobody likes to hear about child abuse for that reason. It's triggering something in all of us. And so people pull back from this issue, just like they do criticism of churches. But it's nevertheless something, like you asked earlier, has it been changing? Yes, it definitely is. Like 10 years ago in Canada, you couldn't mention dead Native children, and now people are talking about it. So this stuff comes around. You just have to be persistent, you know.
And so with the, you know, the semantics of 2,000 years ago and, you know, the name Legion, you know, perhaps we can pull that more into more contemporary times and talk about a lack of empathy, zero empathy from some of these characters we've mentioned so far, and that zero empathy points directly at the illness psychopathy.
Right now, I don't.
And
yeah,
so,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that there's that sort of groupthink herd mentality that doesn't want to step outside of that for fear of you know, the connotations of what can happen in a even if it's covert, there's still perhaps an energetic feeling of oppression and what could happen if you raise your head above the parapet, as
Right.
you have done.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons they don't like examples to spread, and why I've faced such an enormous smear and misinfo campaign, because the powers that be do not want my example to be known widely. Because, I mean, I was just one guy trying to do the right thing, and look at the effect it has, because I didn't give up and because we had solid evidence, right? And I was very public and open about it all the time. That was my protection, that I was. If 100 other people did that on this issue, the whole thing would come down, even 10 others, right? You don't need that many people to bring down the walls of Jericho, right? But, you know, I also don't want to discredit what you're saying in terms of Legion and spiritual reality. Like I've taken part, besides the public exorcism I did outside the Vatican on 2 occasions, I was actually a participant in several exorcisms while I was still a clergyman. And it's a reality. I mean, I know, I've seen it up close. I've felt it, this malevolent evil. And it's an entity, definitely. and it has the power to control people in their minds. And that's why I don't take things personally when the more obviously possessed people are going after me, because they don't know what they're doing, right? So I think it's a reality. When Jesus said legion, or when this possessed man said, "Our name is Legion, for we are many," that's its nature for sure. It's a collectivity, but it's being suggested that at the time, because the 10th Roman Legion was occupying Judea at the time, it was also a political statement, right? This guy was possessed by Legion, the Romans.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And can you pinpoint a specific time when you reached, during your 30-odd years of battling this, as Rupert Sheldrake might call a morphogenetic field, a morphic resonance, when there was perhaps for you an equinox point, a juncture where you felt that you were no longer on the defensive, and you were pushing the docket out, pushing the boundaries, and actually making inroads into perhaps inspiring courage in others. Obviously the common law successes you've had. Yeah, I'm curious as to how your individual progression has gone with regards to confidence and enthusiasm, hope.
It went up and it's kind of a hard question to answer, because it went up and down all the time. And I've just been so through so much that it's hard to pinpoint one moment. But I know for sure that when I saw Native people who were crushed and homeless and had nothing, able to stand up, and I remember this classic incident as something that really turned the tide, is we occupied the largest Catholic cathedral in downtown Vancouver on Palm Sunday, 2008. This would have been March 2008. And one of the guys who did it, William Coombs, who's the one who saw Queen Elizabeth take those children out of the school and never seen again in 1964. There's William in the church, big smile on his face, handing out flyers. He couldn't even go near a Catholic church when he heard the bells. It made him physically ill, because they used to put him on a rack and sodomize him, the priests, every night. And so he couldn't see anything to do with the crucifix without getting literally ill. There he is inside the church handing out flyers. And I couldn't believe it, and also that he had stopped drinking for a while after that, which was amazing for him. He said, "I didn't want to let you guys down. I didn't want to be left out. And when I was in there, I was able to face these priests, and I wasn't afraid of them anymore. They were just a bunch of idiots in robes." So it had lost that fear for them, but he had the protection of all of us when he did it, right? So that's a lesson to me, that this kind of thing, change happens together, people doing it together, and you go right into the heart of their power and you threaten it. You know what? 2 weeks later, the Canadian government announced their Truth and Reconciliation Commission and apologies directly because of that. It was clear that we counted coup, as the natives say. You go in and count coup, prove your bravery as an unarmed warrior against an armed person. You prove that you're braver than them, and you take away their power. That's exactly what we did. Just 20 of us.
Inverted the fear, right?
Yes. And after that, everything came down. After that, the whole thing started collapsing in Canada. And that's why they had to start censoring my name out of the press after 2008. They had to do their bogus apology and whitewash called the TRC. But that was their defensive reaction, acknowledging. I mean, even the New York Times in 2015 had an article where Canada admitted, they call it cultural genocide, to soften the blow, but they said thousands of children died. Okay, but so where's the criminal investigation, people?
And no one's been arrested for that multitude of child murder.
There's never been one person in Canada brought to trial for the death of a child, ever.
And there's so much evidence against a plethora of individuals.
Confessions, people admitting they did it, the eyewitnesses, the documents showing the deliberate practice of taking healthy children and locking them in with kids dying of TB and then never treating them. Doctors openly admitting they were doing that. That's in writing, like murderbydecree.com. It's all there, all the evidence. And even finding bones at the Anglican school in Brantford of children, and the very spot where people had seen them buried. Smithsonian Institute in Washington confirmed it was the child of the bone of a young child, a young girl. The Canadian press didn't even report it, right?
Not one article at the back of a newspaper, nothing.
Nothing. The only one that did was the Mohawk community newspaper. in Brantford. And that was it. It was a total censorship blackout, like with all the stuff we do. So that's an admission of guilt. The fact that I've never been sued, no one's ever countered me with any evidence. They just attack me personally, which is what you do in a court of law. When you don't have any evidence, you've got to destroy the credibility of the witness.
And so the battlefront becomes the media, right? The truth, the propagation of truth.
Well, it does. Alternative media has been one of the ways that this has gotten out. But truth has a power in itself. It's not even relying. It doesn't have to rely on us. It has a momentum in history where it comes out eventually, whether people want it to or not. And then the question is, well, what are people going to do about it? How are you going to change? How are you going to respond to something that's undeniable now, right?
They're reluctant, though. The uncomfortable truth, sorry, the comfortable lie is still generally preferable to the uncomfortable truth.
Well, especially if you've won the war. I mean, Nuremberg happened because the Nazis lost. If they had won, it would have been Churchill and Roosevelt in the docket, right? Accused of being war criminals for bombing Dresden and Hiroshima. So the victors always set the rules, terms of justice and law and everything. And Canada won its war, so it's never had to answer for its crimes. And yet, in the court of public opinion, it has. And it knows it. Every time they open their mouths, they act guilty about this stuff. But all they can do is vent their rage on me. I'm kind of like the figure of Canada's guilty conscience, right?
Okay. Wow, you got broad shoulders.
Oh, well, one thing leads to another.
Okay, and Kev, getting into the guts of it, with regards to the network we mentioned earlier, how much of a priority is child sacrifice to the criminal VIP cabal network, as these child murdering crimes clearly span a multitude of ivory tower factions globally, including the British royal family, as we were talking about the European royal families. I think there's a lot of evidence against various prime ministers and presidents around the world, and the church officials, etc., etc., etc. Would it be an exaggeration to posit that the 9/11 prompted series of continuous wars in the Middle East are a child trafficker's dream, and therefore orchestrated as a priority to increase the prevalence of children as high-profit commodities for criminal ritual ceremony?
I think that's very valid, because we find that whenever in any area of the world where there's war, where there's kind of intergenerational war, like in the Middle East, or in disaster areas like Haiti, child traffickers move in quickly under the cover of child protection agencies, and they grab a lot of the kids, just like they do in countries. I remember when I was in England last in 2011, one of the local activists told me that they had documented, and the Child Protection Agency in England admitted that 567 children had disappeared in the previous month, and they didn't know where they were. This is the government talking, right? Hello, so it's at every level. This child trafficking goes on, usually under the guise of, an established, credible organization.
I was reading an article about the United Nations, and similarly, it's stories as to what allegations as to what you're alluding to, with regards to members of the United Nations child trafficking out of various countries around the world. So, are we looking at pockets of criminals inside, hiding under the cover of legitimate, wholesome organizations, or are we talking about you only get recruited into these organizations if you're, inverted commas, happy to be part of this horror story?
I think it's both. It's like, I was a chaplain for a while, a prison chaplain in Vancouver. I got to know a lot of cops, and common knowledge there in Vancouver, and this was in the 1980s, 90s, that children are trafficked all the time out of the Vancouver Club. It's the elite club downtown. All the business, church, government, military people are part of it. And they knew exactly where the children were being brought from the Indian reservations, from the child protection agencies, from orphanages, Catholic orphanages especially. And they all said the same thing. How could we go up against it when the chief of police himself is involved? We don't want to end up in English Bay, right? you know,
English Bay?
It's the main body near, dumped in the ocean is what they're saying.
Okay, right.
Um,
Concrete wellies.
right. So like, one of the witnesses, her name was Annie Parker. She came forward. She was a former prostitute in Vancouver, and she said, white woman. And she said, she described this thing called the hooker game, where she figured about 1 out of every 10 cops is involved in it. They grab prostitutes, drug them, rape them, film them. If they talk about it, they disappear. Every other cop knew about it, but the 9 honest ones, or at least the 9 ones not involved in it, were under this kind of oath, just like judges have with each other, not to betray the brotherhood and rat out the other cops.
And it's connected with blackmail too, right? Because they're all compromised in some way or other.
Well, I don't know if you saw that film with Al Pacino, Serpico, made back in the 70s.
Okay.
It was about a real story of this honest cop in New York who just wouldn't take money. They brought it around every day in the Bronx and handed him the envelope. And he said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, it's your payoff, right?" He said, "No, I don't want it." Nobody would trust him. After that, nobody would work with them, not because they were all on the take, but because an honest guy upsets the apple cart and can implicate everybody. That's why they have to bury me. That's why the United Church threw me out. The first public defrocking of a ministry in the United Church history, right? Cost $250,000. They had to make an example of me in case anybody other guys might start snitching. When you're guilty body, you do that. You have to keep everybody quiet.
And there was no evidence presented to you whatsoever, and yet you were in a court forum defending yourself against who knows what.
They never said the charges. They admitted there were no charges. They just made it up as they went along, which you can do. And if you're a corporation like the church, right, you're not under the law of the land. Right.
Okay, can we just clear up the Ninth Circle cult, Kevin, and just get a condensed description of all popes, right, are mandatory in the Ninth Circle cult, and this is a sacrificial ritual killing, right?
Yes, the first reference to it is in a Vatican document referring to the Jesuits establishing it sometime in the 17th century as a means of controlling popes. Of course, it harkens back to a much earlier practice in the Roman Empire. For example, the Ninth Circle hold their rituals on February 23rd, 24th in Rome, which were traditionally the festival of Terminalia, where they would sacrifice children and animals for the crops, right? And so it's based on old Roman practices, but it's a Jesuit established custom. It refers to, in the Dante's Inferno, Dante Alighieri in his book, The Inferno, he refers to the 9 levels of hell. And the 9th circle of hell is where Satan is supposed to reside, along with anyone who's betrayed a sacred trust, like to a child, a vow before God, something like that. And that's exactly what they do. They invert their vow, they murder and cannibalize a child. And by that, they make a vow to Satan, asking for unlimited worldly power. It's kind of like right out of Faust, right?
And we have evidence of these 2 recent popes, Francis, Benedict, attending and operating in these Ninth Circle cults.
According to 2 eyewitnesses who saw them both there, according to references made by other people around the Ninth Circle, and sources in Rome. And even now in Argentina, some journalists are beginning to look into what was going on when he was Archbishop in the main cathedral in Buenos Aires, where people admit families would go in there and never come out again, right? A former nun who's living in hiding now in Spain described that. So, there's a lot of kind of mounting evidence about all this.
I'm sure you've heard of Jimmy Savile, the BBC entertainer from the UK. He was a British royal family knight, but he was also a papal knight, and it seemed like he had the key to the door to all the leading politicians and dignitaries of the UK: Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. Yeah. Photos with Savile and all the royals. Is there a Ninth Circle cult that spans to the royal family, and is evidence of Jimmy Savile perhaps being in this cult?
British royal family, man. Yeah, the Ninth Circle is not confined to one country. In fact, it was interesting when I was in London. One of the last few times was when Ratzinger came into town. I don't know if you remember. I think it was September 2010. There was this protest the Pope March. It was great. There was like 20,000 of us in London. They expected 1,000. There was 20 times that number to protest Ratzinger there. Well, Ratzinger was up that same weekend. He was up in Holyrood Castle in Scotland meeting with Liz Windsor. And he stayed overnight. And apparently there was an agreement there. They were negotiating the terms by which she would bring the Church of England back into the Roman fold. Now that's a violation of her coronation oath right there. Boom. Should have been forced into abdication right then. If you're a strict constitutionalist, she abrogated her right to be on the throne at that point. But the fact that they would do that indicates these strong ties that go on. Anglican and Catholic clergy are interchangeable on these things in terms of being seen at these rituals. They're now governed by that same policy I mentioned of crimen solicitanus, where Anglican priests are obligated to cover up child abuse and not tell the police. That's a criminal conspiracy right there. So, I mean, yeah, the ties are direct, right?
And the Deadmans Creek near Kamloops residential school, where William Coombs was the witness, providing evidence for the Queen and her husband Philip's visit there in 1963. 10 children, 64 October, and taken out to a canyon, a creek somewhere, and these children were never seen again. Is this likely to be a cult sacrificial killing, or is there any evidence along those lines?
There's some. First of all, look at the dates. It was October 10th, 1964. If you all that 10th day, 10th month, 1964, all that up to 10, and there were 10 children, 7 boys and 3 girls. Now, when you look in the book of Job, right at the very beginning, it describes how Satan goes out to test Job's faith. God sends out Satan. And one of the first things he does is he kills all of Job's children. A roof collapses on all of them. There were 7 boys and 3 girls.
Exactly the ratio of...
Yes, and we brought a police-accredited psychic with us when we went on the grounds where Williams said they vanished. And she looked over at a hill, and she's done this with the police. She literally points to a hill where people are buried, and they dig and find people there. So she's very empathic. She said she couldn't go near it. She said they're over there. Their bodies are laid out in a cultic configuration. They were killed the same day, and then they were arranged kind of in this weird cultic formation. And William himself was killed at St. Paul's Hospital. The nurse who treated him is online now. I don't know if you've seen that interview.
I saw the interview, right. And so the evidence against the head of the British monarchy is indisputable.
Well, that evidence, now we don't have evidence linking her, like an eyewitness seeing her do it, but definitely by guilt by association, being there at the scene of the crime, not responding. We sent a summons to Buckingham Palace asking her to respond. She never did, which under the law is an admission of guilt. If you don't respond to a summons, court summons in the law, often the case can go against you. The judge can automatically rule against the defendant because they're not defending their good name in public when they've been accused of a crime. That's an admission of guilt under the law. So you add all of that up, and there's much more than just circumstantial evidence, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, and finally, Kev, thanks for your time. What might you envisage are the main differences that the regular rank and file townspeople, the public, will enjoy following the collapse of the Vatican, which seems to be increasingly imminent? You know, the leaks in the dam seem to be increasingly gushing as time goes on. And yeah, following the collapse of the Vatican control network in respect to their everyday lives, will law change? Will politics change? You know, how all-encompassing is the Vatican's control over everyday towns globally?
It's got at a financial level, at a political level, it seems to have a lot of power, like the emperor without clothes. Everyone's convinced this guy has clothes, but when in fact he's naked. And I think you're going to see, we already see a tremendous shakeup going on. When I was last in Ireland, we went into the main Catholic cathedral in Dublin, Pro Cathedral, and it seats 500. We counted 32 on Sunday morning, mostly older people sitting there. If that's going on in Ireland, I mean, that's a sign of the times. The Mapuche Indians in Chile just burned down 28 Catholic churches.
In Chile?
Yeah, well, this is 2 years ago now, but Bergoglio had to go there and he was mobbed by protests. And that's shifting all over. So the Catholic Church is collapsing everywhere except certain parts of the third world. And you find that with all the mainstream churches. And so there is a real awakening happening. So I think it's a good time, because it's kind of like 500 years ago at the Reformation. It's going to have a tremendous reciprocal effect everywhere in society when people break free mentally from this, these false religions, right?
Yeah, so that's that anxiety, that fear that we're speaking about, is seemingly reducing in the congregations. The congregations are dropping, and a couple of the officials, the priesthood, are doing breakaway versions of Christianity. There's factions breaking away from.
There was a group in Ireland, a group of priests who formed a group called Not in Our Name, who said they want to break free from Rome and just have a national church, and free to establish their own doctrine and that kind of reinvent themselves. I've had the same conversations with priests in Canada who try to leave the church, and their bishop comes down on them big time and everything, of course. But I mean, there is that awakening, and people realize that, no, we can have a faith without it harming somebody and being part of a criminal conspiracy in Rome, right?
I was chatting today with a friend here in West Wales, whose friend, so this is a friend of a friend, is about to lose her children to foster care via family law court. She's committed no crime, and they've just decided that she's going to be severed from her kids. And this, is increasing. There's a whole industry of children being commodities with regards to official family law systems. Is that Vatican controlled? Is this sort of thing likely to change with the fall of the Vatican and the popes?
No, I don't want to make it seem that the Vatican just controls everything, because I don't think that's what goes on in the world. There's power, there's competing power centers, and in any group there's factions and everything. So you get all of that playing itself out. So the Vatican establishes the corporate structure that's operating everywhere in the world, right? This is a corporate system where there's no rule of law, there's no democracy, there's administrative courts, there's no appeal process or due process. And the only way people can get justice is to embarrass the crap out of the system and confront them. Like when in England, classic cases, there was a soldier who read our stuff, and he asked his commanding officer if it's true whether the Queen was facing criminal charges. They had him in a psych ward the same day. Well, we found out what the hospital was. We got our people down there. We're picking in the hospital and calling. They released him 2 days later because we embarrassed them. We made it obvious. And we have to do that. That's our only first line of defense, really, is making it all public and embarrassing these people and putting them on notice, right?
What was that guy's name? Was he a Caribbean guy?
Yes.
Lindsay something?
You're right. I can't remember the name offhand, but that...
I'll dig it out. But there seems to be such a correlation, almost a template. Those characteristics you mentioned of how the Vatican law operates seems to translate quite sort of clearly and accurately to various national systems. Well,
it's really, when you look at it historically, you see the Vatican didn't exist by the time Garibaldi he abolished the Papal States in 1870. There was no Vatican until 1929 when Mussolini recreates it, right? As a fascist, you see what fascism is corporatism, which has always been the Catholic model. Pope Pius XXII said, fascism is the social teachings of the Catholic Church made the state. So they want that hierarchical corporate system. And
it facilitates the Inquisition, right? The thought crime aspect.
You're assumed to be guilty. all of the things we take, separation of church and state, natural law, all of that is out the window. And well, look what happens if to a Vatican employee, they're thrown in a Vatican prison if the Pope doesn't like them. So I mean, it's a separate body of law that considers itself the supreme law of everybody. The Pope considers that he has authority over everyone on the planet. I mean, that's still in the teachings. So it's the original kind of fascist state, really, when you look at it. And all this talk of reform and everything, that's just for the media. That doesn't change. The nature of this beast doesn't change, right?
The original corporation spawns all the others. They control the banks, right? The financial system is very Vatican controlled, and through the banks, therefore, the sort of nurturing of various corporate monopoly powers is via the banks, right? They sponsor the corporations they like and stop the ones they don't.
Our researcher, Dr. Catherine Horton in Switzerland, and she's documented that the 10 top banks in the world basically launder their money for offshore accounts, which are then channeled right into the Vatican Bank. And a second bank in Switzerland called the International Development Bank or something. They're kind of like but anyway, it all leads to Rome, basically, right? Like in any church, in any country, they don't have to pay taxes. They launder money for the mob. I found that out in Canada directly, that the United Church was doing that. So they all do it. That's the point. They're protected corporations. You can't know who the directors of the Vatican Bank are. It's never been audited. It's that kind of game.
And in terms of these family names of banking cartels, such as the Rothschilds, is there any clear links and evidence affiliating the Rothschild banking cartel with?
Well, apparently, you see, I'm not an expert in that area, so I don't want to say specifically, but definitely those names keep coming up, like the Orsinis in Italy, like these old Italian families. But again, it's when you look at this stuff, I mean, it's interconnected, right? Because you follow the money, like in any investigation, right?
Yeah. I've been researching a bit of a historian called Webster Tarpley, and he's got an interesting angle on Venice as a power center, and it seems that there's clear links. You see Prince William and a lot of the royals in their regalia of ancient, 500 years ago, Venetian costumes and outfits, and that North Italian banking syndicate seems very, very interesting with regards to history. Going, when you want to trace this parasite or pathogen right back into history, you can't really skip the financial centers connected to it all.
Yeah, that's true. I think, and that's an area often people disregard in the research, partly because it's hard to find out this information because it's so secret.
Right, all covered up.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. Many thanks for your time, Kev.
Oh, anytime. I appreciate it. It's been a great interview. And thank you. I just want to remind folks, murderbydecree.com, and my email is thecommonland@gmail.com. And don't forget too, I wanted to announce in April 14th to 21st, there's an International Day of Action, or National Week of Action, about these criminal churches. There's going to be not just protests and attempted citizen arrests, but direct lobbying of governments to cancel the tax exemptions for these Catholic, Anglican, other churches. Those kind of actions happening on the ground. So we do a Sunday blog show. Unfortunately, it's at 11 p.m. Greenwich time, but it's bbsradio.com and then /Here We Stand, one word. And we have updates about all of this stuff and reports, from the front lines on this work all the time. So I encourage people to tune into that too.
For sure. And I've got to recommend this book, Unrelenting. I think your writing is so incisive, and there's a sort of interesting respite almost with a dry sense of humor running through some of the most horrific chapters, imaginable.
Well, you have to have it.
Yeah. Kev, I just one other thing, if you got him in. I'm just curious about your relationship now with your daughters? I've been robbed of my parental status from a family law court. I was teaching in a Catholic prep school and found a Facebook group where ex-pupils were swapping anecdotes about Downside Abbey in Somerset here in England, where the monks that were affiliated to the school were abusing the kids over many, many decades. And, you know, similar to your scenario, I thought it was important to air this kind of thing. And within a couple of months, I was stripped of my livelihood, my family, and my home. And I'm just curious from, you know, I've got 3 little boys that I don't see any longer. And I'm wondering whether there's a happy ending with regards to your 2 girls.
Well, there's never any happy ending on this stuff. Like the scars, even in the best scenario when marriages end, kids carry the major burden for it, you know. They're forced to choose between parents. There's this whole thing in psychology now, the parental alienation syndrome, where children are deliberately incited against the other parent by, you know, the one who wins in family court. That all happened, and it takes a toll. Like my daughters Claire and Eleanor, one's a midwife and the other actually works for the Canadian government, and yet they love me and they respect what I've done, but they keep their distance, right? Part of it is the natural pain that occurs, you know, that they just don't want to go there again. And, you know, they're in their 20s, and who wants to hang around their parents when they're in their 20s, right? I mean, the thing that's held us together is the fact that I just showed them at every moment I had with them. I just loved them unconditionally, and I was there for them. You keep the communication open somehow. And even if you can't, they'll know one day from the example you set who you are, right? And nobody can take that away, right? Even if it's only one of them. They, you know, you do what's right, and they'll learn one day about it. And you just have to have faith in that. And it's been borne out to some degree, not to the degree that I'd like, but, you know, they are our own children. Nothing can take that from us. You are in them, and nothing's going to take that right away from you. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I was wondering if there's a correlation with your vindication through the progress you're making, and their magnetism to you.
Well, it's funny because you see, their mother, of course, you know, as is described in my book, their mother was approached by the United Church, and she worked with them in return for getting custody of the girls. And Anne, my ex, has never been able to face that. She's still hostile. Now, she was tampered with, I know, psychically and psychologically.
And bribed also?
Bribed, yes. They paid for her lawyer. The United Church paid over $28,000 to her divorce lawyer. They picked up the tab. They encouraged her to leave.
So she was worked basically into a place.
She had been going to a counselor for her own abuse as a kid. That counselor disclosed to the church what he had been telling her, which she had been telling him. Should have got the guy removed, you know, had his counseling license taken away to do that. But anyway, the church used that. They knew which buttons to press in her. And, you know, it worked. But there was also a very weird experience I had in the month before she took off. And I had brought an eagle feather from the native elders I'd been working with, and I was going to give it to her just as a gift, right? To try to kind of mend fences. I was coming up behind her, and I was about 2 feet away from her, and she was looking that way. Without even seeing it, she jumped up like an electric shock had gone through her and said, "Get that thing away from me." Now, what I find interesting is that in an exorcism ritual, it's one of the tests you do is you bring something that's been blessed or something with a connotation of sacredness around it to the possessed person and see how they react. And it had an impact on her. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, okay, there's something going on here I'm not, you know, fully aware of. And her behavior in the years after that indicated absolute possession of some kind, whatever form that takes. But it's, you know, the only thing that can explain why people go nuts like that and stay crazy, that they're under the influence of something. And it's standard operations of how you treat whistleblowers. You go after their family, their livelihood, you know.
Yeah, I do, and that word possession, you know, also fits biologically with host and parasite, right? Back to the energetics of how a morphic resonance, metaphysical energy can manifest into individuals.
Yep, for sure. And that's a reality we deal with all the time. But, you know, it's always, I often just go outside and stand in nature and get grounded again. You know, it's the energy frequency of Mother Earth is the same as what's in the human brain, which I find really interesting. It's very low frequency.
7.83 hertz, the Schumann resonance.
Yeah, there you go. And so it's like we're bombarded by all this electronic garbage all the time, and we just need to get back. And I think it's one of the reasons the Agenda 21 priority is to get everybody in cities by 2050, get them cut off from the land and easily controlled. And we can't let that happen, right?
Yeah. And finally, Kev, one bit that really caught my attention in the book as well was the west coast of Ireland, County Clare, which I think your daughter's named after, right? There was a rickety old tower that you mentioned in the book, and that there was an energetic force that was about during that you felt very viscerally. I think I know the tower you've been to. I've got a great landscape picture of it, so I'm going to post it and see if it's the same one. But yeah, that sounded fascinating.
Yeah, the Cliffs of Moher, they call it.
Yeah, Cliffs of Moher.
Yeah, 700 feet tall, and there's an old castle there, and it definitely felt very different, very almost like a portal of some kind there, you know, an opening, a thin, you know, a place like they say in Ireland, the veil is thin in some place. But yeah, so.
They say the same about the equinox time where we are now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okie dokie. Thanks heaps for your time, Kevin. It's been very good,
brother. And you know, we can do it again anytime you like. We can give you updates, and
yeah, that'd be great.
I'll write to you offline about that.
Yeah, plenty more to discuss. You got a busy day planned for the rest of it.
Oh, as usual, yeah.
Okie dokie. It's getting late over here in Europe. Got to shoot off. Thanks heaps for your time, Kev. All the best.
And please send me a link.
Yes, I certainly will.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers, Kev. Take care.
Cheers. Yep. You too.